Elton John's eyes filled with tears, and Jimmy Fallon didn't know what to do. Then that voice came again, and everything changed. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday night taping of The Tonight Show. The kind of episode where jokes fly, guests laugh, and America tunes in for a predictable dose of entertainment. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his desk, tie perfectly knotted, cards shuffled, band ready. Elton John, rock royalty in his signature flamboyant glasses and colorful suit, settled into the guest chair with the ease of someone who'd done 1,000 interviews. The audience buzzed with excitement. Phones were silenced. Cameras rolled. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. But in exactly 7 minutes, nothing would ever be routine again. Because what happened next wasn't in the script. It wasn't planned. And it would become the moment that redefined what The Tonight Show could be. The segment had started like any Elton John interview, predictably brilliant. Jimmy asked about the new tour. Elton talked about his farewell performances, his voice steady, his stories polished from decades of telling them. The Roots provided a subtle musical backdrop. The audience laughed at the right moments. Then Jimmy did what he always does. He pivoted to something personal. "You've performed for millions of people," Jimmy said, leaning forward slightly. "But I've always wondered, is there a voice, just one voice out there, that you've never heard but always wanted to?" It was meant to be a softball question. A setup for a funny anecdote, or a touching story about a fan letter. Elton smiled, opened his mouth to respond with something charming and rehearsed. And then it happened. From somewhere in the audience, a voice began to sing. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just purely. A single voice, a cappella, floating through the studio like a ghost made of sound. The melody was unmistakable. "Your song." Elton's song. But the voice was something else entirely. Elton John stopped mid-sentence. His smile froze. His hands, which had been gesturing casually, dropped to his lap. He turned his head slowly toward the audience, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper. Something raw. Jimmy Fallon stopped breathing. The entire studio froze. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The voice continued. It wasn't perfect in a technical sense. There were no vocal runs, no showing off, no attempt to impress. But there was something in it. Something that made every person in that room, from the camera operators to the producers in the booth to the 200 people in the audience, stop what they were doing and listen. Jimmy's first instinct was to look at his producers. This wasn't supposed to happen. Audience members don't just start singing during a live taping. Security should have intervened. The director should have cut away. But nobody moved. Nobody stopped it. Because even through the confusion, everyone felt it. This wasn't a disruption. This was something sacred. Elton John's eyes began to glisten. He removed his glasses, something he rarely did on camera, and set them carefully on Jimmy's desk. His jaw tightened. He didn't look at Jimmy. He didn't look at the cameras. He just stared out into the audience, toward that voice, as if trying to see through the lights and find its source. Jimmy Fallon, the man who built a career on never missing a beat, on filling every silence with a joke or a gesture, sat completely still. His cards lay forgotten on the desk. His hands gripped the edge of the wood. He looked at Elton, then at the audience, then back at Elton. The voice finished the first verse and stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "Who?" Elton's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Who is that?" Jimmy stood up. Not because a producer told him to. Not because it was in the script. He stood up because something in his gut told him that this moment was bigger than the show, bigger than the schedule, bigger than the millions of dollars of production happening around him. "Let's find out," Jimmy said quietly. He stepped out from behind his desk, something he almost never did during an interview segment. The audience audibly gasped. This was protocol breaking. This was television heresy. But Jimmy didn't care. He walked to the edge of the stage, shielding his eyes from the lights, scanning the audience. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He was about to stop the show. Completely. "Can we bring the house lights up?" Jimmy called out to the booth. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. An urgency. For a moment, nothing happened. Producers scrambled. Protocols dictated that you never, ever bring the house lights up during a live taping. It ruins the television magic. It exposes the machinery. But then, slowly, the lights came up. The audience was revealed in full. Rows and rows of faces, all staring back at Jimmy with a mix of excitement and confusion. And there, in the middle section, about 12 rows back, a woman stood. She was older. Maybe in her late 60s. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans. Her hands were clasped in front of her, trembling slightly. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't sobbing. She was just standing there, looking at Elton John like she was seeing a miracle. "Ma'am," Jimmy said, his voice carrying through the now silent studio. "Was that you?" She nodded, unable to speak. Jimmy looked back at Elton. The rock legend was standing now too, one hand on the desk to steady himself. His face was a mask of emotion barely contained. "Would you come down here?" Jimmy asked gently. "Please?" The woman hesitated. People around her encouraged her, patting her shoulders, moving aside to let her pass. She walked slowly down the aisle, each step careful, as if she might wake up from a dream. When she reached the stage, Jimmy extended his hand and helped her up. The audience began to applaud, but Jimmy raised his hand, asking for quiet. This wasn't a moment for applause yet. This was a moment for understanding. Jimmy guided her to the center of the stage, positioning her between himself and Elton. She looked terrified and euphoric all at once. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked softly, holding a microphone toward her. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Henderson." "Clara," Elton repeated, his accent making the name sound almost musical. "That was extraordinary." She covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. "Tell us," Jimmy said, his voice impossibly gentle. "Why did you sing?" Clara took a shaky breath. "Because," she began, her voice stronger than expected. 52 years ago, my husband proposed to me while your song played on a record player in his tiny apartment. He couldn't afford a ring. He couldn't afford much of anything. But he had that record. And he played it, and he asked me to marry him, and I said yes. The studio was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. He passed away," Clara continued, tears now flowing freely. 3 months ago. Lung cancer. And before he died, he made me promise something. He made me promise that if I ever got the chance to hear Elton John in person, I would sing. Because he couldn't anymore. Because his voice was gone, but mine wasn't. And I know it's not. I know I'm not. "Don't," Elton interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't you dare diminish what you just did." But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Elton John walked over to Clara. He took both of her hands in his. And then, this man who had performed for presidents and queens, who had filled stadiums and broken records, who was a living legend, looked into the eyes of this ordinary woman and said, "Would you sing it with me?" Clara's eyes went wide. I can't." "Yes, you can," Elton said firmly. "For him. Sing it with me. For your husband." Jimmy Fallon, standing to the side, felt his own eyes burning. He looked at the cameras, at his producers, at the Roots. Everyone was crying. Questlove had his drumsticks in his hands but wasn't playing, just watching, tears streaming down his face. Jimmy made another split-second decision. He reached up, loosened his tie, pulled it off, and set it on his desk. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. This wasn't the Tonight Show anymore. This wasn't television. This was life, raw and real, happening in front of everyone. Elton sat down at the piano that was always on stage, the one usually reserved for musical guests and sketches. He positioned his hands over the keys and looked up at Clara. Whenever you're ready, he said gently. Clara closed her eyes. She took a breath. And then she began. Her voice was shaky at first, almost breaking on the first few words. But Elton's piano was there, supporting her, lifting her up. And then his voice joined hers, blending, harmonizing, creating something that had never existed before and would never exist again. The audience, collectively, lost it. People stood. People wept. Strangers held hands. A man in the front row had his arm around a woman he'd never met, both of them sobbing openly. Jimmy Fallon stood stage left, arms crossed, watching. His face was wet with tears. He wasn't hosting anymore. He wasn't performing. He was just a human being, witnessing something profound. When the song ended, Clara and Elton held the final note together. The piano's last chord hung in the air. And then silence. Elton stood. He embraced Clara, holding her tightly. She buried her face in his shoulder and wept. The audience erupted into applause, but it wasn't performative. It was cathartic. It was release. Jimmy approached them slowly. He put one hand on Clara's shoulder and one on Elton's. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you both." Clara pulled back from Elton, wiping her face with her hands. "I'm sorry I interrupted." "You didn't interrupt anything," Jimmy said firmly. "You gave us something. You gave everyone watching something they'll never forget." Elton reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Not for himself, for Clara. He handed it to her with a gentle smile. "Keep this," he said. "And know that somewhere your husband heard that. I promise you he heard it." Clara took the handkerchief, clutching it like it was made of gold. She nodded, unable to speak. Jimmy helped her off the stage, ensuring she got back to her seat safely. The audience gave her a standing ovation as she walked up the aisle, and she turned back once, waving shyly, before sitting down. When Jimmy returned to his desk, Elton was back in the guest chair. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Jimmy spoke. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice still rough with emotion. "Then don't say anything," Elton replied. "Some moments don't need words." They sat there, two men on a stage, surrounded by cameras and lights and the machinery of television, and just existed in the aftermath of something beautiful. Eventually, the show continued. They talked about music and tours and funny anecdotes. But everyone knew that the real interview had already happened. The real show had already aired. When the taping wrapped, Jimmy didn't leave the stage immediately. He stood there, looking out at the empty audience seats, replaying the moment in his mind. His producer approached cautiously. "Jimmy, that was—" "I know," Jimmy said quietly. "Do we air it?" Jimmy turned to look at him, incredulous. "Are you kidding? That's the show. That's the whole show." And it was. When the episode aired 3 days later, it broke the internet. The clip was shared millions of times. News outlets covered it. Think pieces were written. Clara was invited to dozens of shows, though she politely declined most of them. But the real impact was quieter. It was in the emails Jimmy received from people who had lost someone, who felt seen. It was in the messages from viewers who said they cried, that they called their loved ones, that they felt something they hadn't felt in years. Jimmy Fallon kept his tie in his dressing room after that night. He didn't wear it again. Instead, he hung it on the wall, a reminder. A reminder that the best television isn't planned. That the most powerful moments come from breaking the rules. That sometimes, the show isn't about the show at all. It's about the people in the room, and the connections we make when we're brave enough to be real. Elton John never forgot Clara. He mentioned her in interviews. He dedicated performances to her late husband. And somewhere in his vast collection of memorabilia, he kept a photograph from that night, a photograph of him and Clara, mid-song, creating something that mattered. Share and subscribe, make sure this story is never forgotten. Because on that Tuesday night, in a television studio in New York City, 3 people, a host, a legend, and a widow, showed the world what happens when you let the walls come down. When you stop performing and start feeling. When you remember that behind every voice, every note, every moment, there's a story. There's a life. There's love. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, all of that collides in a way that changes everything. Jimmy Fallon walked into The Tonight Show the next day and sat at his desk. He picked up his cards. He shuffled them. He prepared for another taping. But he wasn't the same person who had sat there the night before. None of them were. And that's the thing about moments like that. They don't just live in the people who experience them. They ripple outward, touching everyone who witnesses them, reminding us all that behind every performance, every song, every show, there are real human hearts beating. That night, Jimmy Fallon learned what Clara and Elton already knew: the most powerful voice isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the one that carries love across time, across loss, across a crowded studio, and straight into the soul of anyone willing to listen.